Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 6 of his Dark Materials, The Abyss. Buckle up folks, because I know that this episode is going to be on the longer end of things. So much goes on in this episode and there are a lot of important details and a lot of me wanting to comment on them. So apologies in advance, feel free to skip around as I'm sure you already do. Anyway, let's get straight into it. This episode starts with some narration from the regent of the Kingdom of Heaven, Metatron. He tells us that in the beginning, man was given the gift of dust. This gift of dust ignited his mind and freed his will, but it also corrupted man. Due to this corruption, dust will be drawn into eternal darkness once more. After this revelation about the nature of dust and its connection to man, we see the aftermath of the bomb from the previous episode. Mrs. Coulter, thankfully, is alive and she's rousing herself and the golden monkey. Father MacPhail, of course, did not fare so well. He did sacrifice himself for the bomb. He is dead and his lizard demon is no more. The golden monkey sees that Lord Roke is dead. There's nothing they can do for him. And in all of the uncertainty, all of the carnage, all of the damage, Mrs. Coulter has an idea. She really wants to know if the bomb was successful or not, and she has the stroke of brilliance to go visit Fra Pavel, the alethiometrist who works for the Magisterium. She knows that he has access to a potential answer, and she rushes off to find him. When she poses the question to Fra Pavel and he uses his alethiometer to ask about Lyra's whereabouts and her status, the alethiometer tells him that Lyra is in darkness. We know, as the audience, that she has been in darkness for some time because she elected to go to the land of the dead, but this is not the news that Mrs. Coulter wants to hear. Elsewhere, Azrael has a much different response. He sees the gaping abyss that has opened up and the landslide right next to his Republic of Heaven that he's trying to establish, and he seems absolutely delighted by it. For him, this is a physical and visual cue that his plan with Metatron, with Alarbus the angel, is working, and that he has drawn the attention of the authority and that they eventually will show themselves. He is a complete and utter maniac, by the way. In yet another world, in the Mulefa world, Mary understands that something huge has happened and that the flow of dust that she had perceived through her hunk of amber has changed. It was previously a gradual flow out of the world, and now it feels like a flood of sroff or dust is leaving the world, which is terrible news for her and her Mulefa friends. This is definitely a catastrophe of some kind, and Seraphina also senses it. We see her flying across the worlds, and she notes at some point that the abyss that the bomb has created transcends every world and is a common experience and is very alarming. Now that Father President is dead and the Magisterium is kind of in physical shambles, Mrs. Coulter takes the opportunity to leave Magisterium HQ in the Intention craft and fly back to Azrael to share the news of Lyra's passing. Azrael is too excited to really pay much attention to Mrs. Coulter's news and tells Mrs. Coulter that the abyss is actually a gift in disguise. He is planning on using the abyss, harnessing its power to trap and store dust against the authority. He seems quite unmoved by the idea that his only child might have died, and he announces to Mrs. Coulter that the work that he's doing with his rebellion is far more important than anything else. He's been working for this for such a long time, and he's really on the cusp of something great. Mrs. Coulter does not take this well. She is beyond furious, and she actually blames Lyra's death on Lord Azrael, and it does make sense. Lord Azrael really chose to piss off the authority, and as a response to that, they decided to kill Lord Azrael's daughter. So I understand her thinking here, though there are a few steps missing along the way, and of course Lyra probably isn't dead, so there's that. But she is convinced that this is Azrael's doing, and she wants him to take accountability for it. She tells Azrael that the angelic light that activated the bomb was Metatron's answer to Azriel's shenanigans with Alarbus. Azriel's to-do list has a lot on it, and there is not an item that includes grieving his daughter's death. So we see him actively exploring the abyss against the better judgment of his demon Stelmaria, who asks him to stop being so reckless. We come to understand, at the same time as Azriel, that the abyss captures dust and dust is attracted to it. This happens when Rutaskadi's demon, Sergei, is summoned by the abyss somehow, or he finds himself trapped in it and he can't quite get out of it. And as he is sucked deeper and deeper into this canyon, this abyss that is yawning before us, Rutaskadi actually dies in the arms of Commander Ogunwe, who is just helpless in the face of what's going on. Ruta cannot fight against it. She can't motivate Sergei to fly away. And as Sergei disappears into the abyss, Ruta dies, and it's upsetting and confusing and very sad. Ogunwe is very, very pissed about this passing of Ruta, and he's very concerned that Azriel doesn't understand the gravity of his actions. But again, Azriel is on his own plane of thinking and tells his council that the abyss is actually a gift, that the authority that Metatron has given him inadvertently, this gift of the ability to capture dust, and he plans on using it against them. Serafina senses Ruta's death when it happens and hears Ruta calling for Yambe Aka, only to realize that it's too late, and she flies to Azriel's headquarters, sensing Ruta's presence there. When she lands, very unafraid of what is about to happen to her, I may add, confronted by all of Azriel's security, she demands to know what happened to Ruta, and they explain to her that Sergei fell into the abyss and Ruta subsequently died. Serafina is beyond enraged by this and knows who Azriel is, knows how the story started with him building the bridge, killing Roger in the process, and she is not a fan of Azriel. She is ready to avenge her witch sister when Azriel, so smoothly as usual, spins the story and tells her that if she wants vengeance, she will only find vengeance in using her powers and her resources to fight the authority by his side, rather than taking Azriel out. Azriel is really deflecting the blame of Ruta's passing onto Metatron. No accountability once again. He is a master of deflection. And he's able in this way to recruit Serafina to his cause. She kind of steps into Ruta's place on the War Council and becomes the head witch of this operation. Mrs. Coulter is rather listlessly wandering around Azriel's headquarters, unsure of what to do since Azriel doesn't seem to give a fuck about Lyra. She is definitely not in a good place emotionally, and at some point the golden monkey actually leaves her. She asks him, or rather commands him to come on wherever she's going, and he walks in the other direction, and this feels like a low moment for Mrs. Coulter. Serafina Pekla walks in on Mrs. Coulter sulking alone. Mrs. Coulter recognizes Serafina as a witch, of course. Mrs. Coulter tries to provoke Serafina into attacking Mrs. Coulter. It almost seems like she takes some kind of pleasure in goading Serafina by recounting all of the terrible, fucked up things that she's done to witches. But Serafina does not take the bait, and she tells Mrs. Coulter she knows exactly who she is and what she's done, and she is not willing to do Mrs. Coulter the favor of killing her. I really liked the scene between Serafina and Mrs. Coulter, and I thought it was an interesting parallel between Lyra's biological mother, Mrs. Coulter, and the person who I really consider Lyra's adoptive mom, Serafina. Serafina has provided so much protection to Lyra throughout the series and has really guided her and supported her and believed in her and done quite a bit to keep her safe, moving around a lot of pieces, supporting Lee Scoresby, helping Yorick at various times. And the two women confronting each other and really listening to each other was kind of refreshing and just an interesting character study. Serafina has heard that Lyra has passed. Serafina tells Mrs. Coulter that she also feels a great sadness about Lyra's death. And Mrs. Coulter responds by telling Seraphina that she didn't actually love Lyra. She tried, but she wasn't able to because she's too warped. Mrs. Coulter confides in Seraphina that she was so terrified about this prophecy about Lyra because she had been taught her entire life that Eve had done something extremely shameful, that this sin that Eve brought into the world was really a great curse. Seraphina actively pushes against this and tells Mrs. Coulter that the magisterium fears what it doesn't understand. And she sets the record straight. She says that all Eve did was dare to experience. She says that it was an act of bravery and of great beauty. Seraphina also tells Mrs. Coulter that Mrs. Coulter was indeed a monster, but look at how love and experience changed Mrs. Coulter. She's no longer the same person that she was before, and that's what love did. This reframing that Seraphina gives of Eve's choice to eat the forbidden fruit as a daring to experience is pretty fucking huge, and I think is probably one of the top 3 biggest points of the entire series. I think the idea that experience is greater than innocence is groundbreaking, especially in books that are maybe not designed for children, but are often read by children. Certainly in stark contrast to all of C.S. Lewis's books celebrating purity, innocence, childhood, naivete. Philip Pullman really pushes back on the idea that we should apologize for growing up, that we should apologize and feel bad about experiencing the pleasures that our earthly senses give to us, whether that's food, whether that's sex, whether that's self-knowledge. And I think it's important that this tidbit is relayed from one woman to another. I think that is a very feminist approach that the show took to reclaiming Eve as the hero of the story rather than the villain. Certainly very in line with Philip Pullman's work and ideas. Philip Pullman wrote the introduction to this edition of Paradise Lost, and in this introduction he writes, "Innocence is not wise, and wisdom cannot be innocent. And if we are going to do any good in the world, we have to leave childhood behind." Honestly, I could spend a long time talking about this. This is something I clearly feel very passionate about. I'm thinking about making a video about the larger themes of his dark materials, but that might be a bit too much for people who are just casually watching recaps of a TV show. If that might be of interest to you, please feel free to leave a comment. I would love to hear your opinion and also your ideas about it. In another very interesting encounter between characters, Asriel leaves his headquarters to head north and find Uric Burnison. Uric Burnison recognizes him immediately and knocks him straight on his ass, and we think we might be about to see the end of Lord Asriel when Lord Asriel explains that he wants to ask Uric Burnison about Lyra. He knows that Uric cared for Lyra tremendously and knew Lyra quite well, and all this time he's talking about Lyra in the past. Uric tells Asriel that Lyra is everything that he is not, and this feels like a blow to Asriel. We can see it on his face that this lack of respect from Uric stings in a way that maybe Asriel hadn't anticipated. I also really love this parallel, and I thought it was quite similar to the one we previously saw between Seraphina and Mrs. Coulter, in that we kind of have Lyra's adoptive father in Uric and Lyra's biological father in Asriel, and the two are confronting one another. Uric has done so much to protect and guide and shape Lyra, and has really been there for her during some very challenging situations, whereas Asriel has done absolutely nothing for her and has kind of been her adversary in a way throughout the course of the show. Uric sees the confusion that is happening and clarifies to Asriel that Lyra isn't dead. She actively chose to go to the land of the dead to help free her friend Roger, who incidentally, Lord Asriel himself killed and sent to the land of the dead. Asriel, of course, is always making this about him, recognizes that he somehow caused a lot of this, and that she is staging what turns out to be a prison break, much like he did earlier in the season with Commander Ogunwe, that she is staging her own revolution and rebellion against the authority. It's just happening in a place that he can't see and that he never anticipated. And that, holy shit, maybe his daughter is good for something. Maybe she's more than just an ignorant little brat. She's actually doing something monumental and important. His daughter, of course. He takes credit for her because he contributed to her genetic material. Urich is not shy about sharing his displeasure with Azriel. Azriel has not only caused this gigantic abyss, but the original bridge across the worlds that he created completely fucked Urich's ecosystem, his home, his kingdom, and his ability for his people to feed themselves. He is responsible for the original climate catastrophe of the book, and Urich has not forgotten this and is very, very pissed about it. Azriel doesn't seem to think that that's such a big deal, though he does express a tiny bit of remorse about it. He's not willing to change anything, though, of course, and he can't take it back. Getting back to that attempt at a prison break, the good news is that the kids have survived the bomb. They are both alive and well. I don't know if ghosts can be killed again, but Roger, Lee, and the ghosts that we know have all survived. In the show, the chasm that we see is weirdly alluring for Lyra and Will, though we're not sure if the ghosts feel the same way, but there's this almost drive to fall into the abyss below them, and we see Lyra and Will both enraptured by the golden light that we see falling into the valley. It kind of reminded me of the idea of a death drive, of those intrusive thoughts that we all sometimes have of what would happen if I drove off this bridge right now, or what would happen if I stumbled out of this car. As Will and Lyra are continuing on their journey to lead the ghosts to higher ground so that they can cut their window, they reach a point where there isn't a way to move forward. It looks like when the bomb went off, it disrupted some of the junk that is creating the terrain, and they literally cannot go further. There's a huge gap between where they're standing and where the path resumes. And at this point, when they're kind of stuck wondering how to go about this, Lyra makes the mistake of looking into the abyss, and she very slowly falls into it. None of the ghosts can do anything to help her, and Will can't help her either. And we think this really might be Lyra's demise. But fortunately for her, the harpies are keeping tabs on the situation, and one of them swoops down to catch Lyra before she falls further, and this harpy takes her to safety. Lyra is stunned, and somehow everyone else catches up with her, and when Will helps Lyra get up and asks her how she's doing, she goes to the harpy and she says that she wants to give the harpy something to express her gratitude. When she previously asked the harpy what her name was, the harpy told her her name was No Name. So she chooses to give the harpy a new name, and she decides to call her Gracious Wings. Lyra uses this opportunity to strike a deal with Gracious Wings, realizing that Gracious Wings and the other harpies really enjoyed the stories that Lyra was telling the ghosts about her life. And the harpy tells Lyra that they had never heard those stories before, and that those true stories were very nourishing. It fed them something other than the negativity and the lies that they're usually surrounded by. And Lyra gets the idea that she wants to give the harpies another job. She wants the harpies to lead the ghosts as they enter the land of the dead to this new window that they're creating. And in exchange, since this should be a fair bargain, the ghosts will have to tell the harpies about their lives that they lived. They'll have to share all the experiences, the true experiences that they had while they were living, and that would be equal payment. There is an exception for babies who haven't had the opportunity to experience much, but if the creatures that come into the land of the dead have lived a substantial amount of time and have nothing to share, they don't get entry into this window that the kids are about to create. And Gracious Wings agrees to this. It seems like a better job than the one she's been doing, and also a fair trade for serving as guides. Lee Scoresby hears that Will is looking to reunite with someone as well, and that someone is actually John Perry, who Lee knows quite well. And when the two of them realize they're talking about the same person, Lee immediately gets to work attempting to find John Perry for Will, and he does. Right after this episode with Gracious Wings, Lee tells Will that he has someone he wants to see, and Will goes off a little bit on his own into a cave far away from Lyra and Roger to have this conversation with his dad. I'm not really sure why they did this. I was glad to see John Perry again in ghost form, but I would have loved to have seen the meeting between John Perry and Lyra occur, since he plays such an important part in the book in The Land of the Dead. But in any case, the two have a very sweet and hard and emotionally complex reunion. Will tells his dad that he hasn't done what his dad has asked him to do, and he's also not the person that his dad thought that he was. He tells him that he's not a fighter in his heart. With some grief, it sounds like, Will tells his dad that, "I'm not who you want me to be." And John Perry says, "No, you're so much more." This is such a touching moment, one that really made me think about the relationship between parents and children, and just that idea of having that vulnerability and being able to tell your parent that your parent had these expectations of you and you're not living up to them. And then to hear your parents say, "No, you're not. You're so much more than I wanted you to be." It really made me wonder if that's what we all secretly long to hear from our parents in our lives. This moment was also an interesting contrast because both of Will's parents have had real expectations of him. We hear Elaine Perry tell Will that she's always expected him to take up his father's mantle. At the time, Will doesn't understand what that means. And then in the last season, when we finally meet John Perry tells Will that he's a warrior, that he has to do this thing for Azrael and the Republic. Whereas Lyra's parents have never expected a fucking thing from her. They've had not only no expectations, but almost negative expectations that she's gonna do what she's gonna do, and that they have no interest in helping her cultivate or nourish her strengths. And yet Lyra has done so much in their absence. I don't know, is it better to have no expectations, to have too many? Really an interesting question. John Perry knows things. As a shaman, he is able to access information that us mere normal mortals cannot, and he tells Will that Will's demon is alone with Pan and is very vulnerable, and it's really important that the kids find their demons as soon as they're out of the land of the dead. Will's dad also makes Will promise that he will not try to live in a world that is not his own. He explains to Will that it is very harmful for demons to try to live in a world that they don't originally come from, and that he himself experienced the downfall of not being able to get back home. He died prematurely, probably because of that, also because he was killed by someone. But he was very sick for 10 straight years. He says that Will and his demon won't survive it, so it's very critical that they get back to their world. He tells Will that Will deserves a full life with his mother. In the book, he tells Will that this is the reason that Azrael's Republic will not ultimately succeed. The Republic is not sustainable in its physical form because it necessitates people leave the world that they grew up in to inhabit somewhere else. And this is a fundamentally flawed idea. He says that we need to build the Republic of Heaven in every world rather than trying to limit it to one, because we belong where we were born and we have to stay there. This isn't something that the show spends a lot of time on, and I wish they had talked more about it or made it a bit more obvious, because I think it's important. I think one of the many main messages I realize of his Dark Materials is that you have to build the Republic of Heaven where you are, in whatever situation, in whatever community, and that takes work. There is no perfect place. The perfect place is where you are already. Speaking of the Republic of Heaven, back in the world where Azrael has headquartered his mission, Seraphina tells Azrael and Mrs. Coulter that the kids' demons are alone and vulnerable and that they definitely need protection. She plans on sending Kaisa, her demon, to find them, and then she'll eventually catch up with them. But it's important that Mrs. Coulter and Azrael put aside their projects to really focus on that mission. She makes no bones about it. She tells them that Lyra's mission in freeing the dead from the prison of the land of the dead is a project that is much, much more significant than Azrael could possibly do here, and that it's really time for them to devote their efforts and energies to Lyra. This is kind of a wake-up call for Azrael. He seems shaken almost by how certain Seraphina is. This might be the slap in the face that he needs to get over his own ego. He is no longer the most important rebel on the scene. That honor is passing to his daughter. After this moment of hard truths with Seraphina came another scene that, I'll be honest, absolutely destroyed me emotionally. I was in tears. It is the scene when Mrs. Coulter finally catches up with her golden monkey demon who has been shunning her, and she asks him if she can sit down next to him. The fact that she's even asking him and approaching him is in itself a marker that something has shifted within her. She recognizes that she's being rejected by a piece of herself, and she seems to want to make amends. The golden monkey is open to this conversation, it seems, and as she sits down, she tells the golden monkey that she pretends that it doesn't hurt her when she sends him away, but it actually really does. When she first started the practice of sending him away, it was mostly due to her own curiosity, wondering what it would feel like, what would happen, but she recognizes that it's become something different now. She tells her demon that when she sends him away, it's a way for her to not feel what she can't bear. She also confesses to him that she used to think that she was the strong one of the two, but now she recognizes that he has been the stronger person all along. And then she says, "I'm so very sorry. Please come back to me." And she sticks out her hand, and the golden monkey puts his hand in hers. And for once, she doesn't hit him, she doesn't maim him. It's really a moment where she genuinely apologizes to him, and by extension herself, for pushing him away and doing that thing that she did in season 2 when she left him to command the specters of indifference. She tucks away her humanity when she leaves him, and she's finally recognizing that she needs him. She needs that piece of her, that emotional kind of primal child that he is, and she's not whole without him. If you've seen any of my videos, you know that I am obsessed with Mrs. Coulter and her golden monkey demon and the relationship between the two. So this scene, which is not in the book, was so deeply satisfying and beautiful and emotional, and it felt incredibly redemptive and like such a turning point in her character. It was really more than we could have asked for, I think, and I was so glad that we got this moment of emotional honesty from her. It's been such a long time coming, and I recognize that we still can't hear the golden monkey speak in a language we understand, so I think that's permanent, but the two are finally on the same page, and she's being honest with him and kind to him and loving to him. And it just was a balm for my heart to see that amazing scene. After a very long slog and much struggle, the kids have finally reached the highest point they can possibly get to in the land of the dead, and it is finally time for Will to cut a window out of the land of the dead to free the ghosts. Of course, that means that Roger and Lyra will be parting ways, and they have a very, very sweet goodbye. It's very emotional for Lyra especially. Roger seems excited at at the idea of being in the world again, dissolving into all of the atoms that make up his spirit and joining the world. And he is first to go through the window, followed just shortly by Lee, who is so excited to reunite with beloved Hester again. He knows that they will spend as long as they need to finding each other in every blade of grass and every dewdrop. It's a beautiful, sweet end to a really bitter, terrible experience in the land of the dead. The world that Will cuts into, unknowingly of course, is the world where the Mulefa inhabit. Mary, in that world already, hears a whisper on the wind saying, "Tell them stories." And the ghosts are passing along this message amongst themselves to tell the harpies their true stories, and that will be their freedom, their ticket out of the land of the dead. And it's such a nice end to this piece. And with that, Lyra has satisfied a piece of the prophecy about her. She has brought an end to death. That is, of course, another takeaway of his Dark Materials and Philip Pullman's work, this urge to tell them stories. And of course, we don't have to wait until we die to tell stories. Telling stories is such a crucial, important part of our experience while we're alive. I really loved this episode. I thought it had so many important, really emotional, really moving moments. I also feel like the pace is really picking up. We only have 2 episodes left, so we'll be seeing a lot of things happen very, very shortly. Thank you again so much for joining me. I'd love to hear any thoughts about the episode, any thoughts at all in the comments. Looking forward to reading them. And as always, thanks for being with me, and I'll see you next time. Bye.